Welcome to Christina's Cleaning and Homemaking. If you're new here, and welcome back if you've been here before. As always, I ask that you please click the subscribe button down below, and if you click on the little bell, YouTube will let you know when I have new videos up. You can select from 3 options, so if you ask for notifications of all videos, whenever I have a new one up, you'll get notified, which if you like my videos, I highly recommend that. And if you could please click the like button down below, that's always appreciated, and I look forward to your comments on this video as well. This video is going to be about Humana Vitae, and the anniversary of Humana Vitae was actually just this week, 2 days ago, and the Contraception Deception, written by Patrick Coffin, which is about the church's teaching on it. So let's get a look at that. Okay, so I spent probably a little over a week reading this book, mostly because of busy making rosaries and managing the family and everything, but it was well worth the read. It goes into detail on Humana Vitae, which was written by Pope Paul VI. It was probably his most controversial encyclical that he's ever written, and it was in a time when people were becoming rebellious, to say the least. I have to say that when I first started reading it, I expected to be sort of a teaching, defending Humana Vitae right from the start type of book, and it's not, but that's not a bad thing. I read the acknowledgement, I read the introduction, and I started into chapter 1, and in chapter 1, Patrick Coffin talks about how we got here. So basically the steps that led into the point where we have a contracepting culture now, and an issue where this is even an argument. And he goes through that in chapter 1. He also sets up a quiz that's in chapter 7, giving questions of, testing your knowledge on the history of contraception and the church, and in the secular world for that matter too, as far as viewpoints go. Chapter 2, that was a good chapter, I have to say. Chapter 1 is how we got here. Chapter 2 is escape from dissent. It focuses in more on Patrick Coffin's life, and he was a dissenter initially, which I honestly didn't expect. I didn't realize, because he's so hardcore Catholic now, that he was ever a dissenter. It just baffled my mind reading that. But the beauty of that in this book is because he starts out explaining what his dissent was and why, and how it was overcome. And so that makes this book really good, especially for those who might balk at Humana Vitae and the church's teaching against contraception. So if you at least have an open mind and want to know why the church teaches what it does, and see it from the vantage point of someone who started out for contraception and thinking, well, it's not a bad thing, to coming over to the side of the church's teaching going, wow, this is really bad. I think you'll like this book and you'll get a lot out of it. He packs it full of information. The 3rd chapter is Who's Your Daddy, which basically it covers the teaching authority of the church. He covers very well in this book the 3-legged stool, scripture, magisterium, and tradition. And so in chapter 3, he establishes why the church has authority to say anything about this at all, and he does a really good job on it. The 4th chapter is birth control in the Bible, and yes, he actually does go into scripture showing the condemnation of the use of birth control. And specifically, he goes into the sin of Onan and explains why that was a problem and why Onan was struck dead for spilling a seed. And he also poses the Protestant argument and challenges it and answers it. It's really, he did a beautiful job on that. The next chapter is birth control and the Blessed Trinity, and he does a phenomenal job of tying that all together. He really does. The 6th chapter is contraception and the natural law, and the church's teaching, as he points out, is heavily rooted in the natural law. Even though there's scriptural background for the teaching against contraception, the church roots it in the natural law, which I suppose is actually kind of a good idea, because the secular world isn't going to pay attention to scripture. So if you can communicate something to the secular world saying this is evidence for why the church has this teaching, it makes it much harder for them to argue with it. The next chapter is the answers to the questions from chapter 1, and he does a good job of going through and explaining the answers to that. And then in chapter 8, he covers the population bomb myth, which is such a myth, it's not even funny. And he covers various people who have made some sort of statement about how there being, an overpopulation and they need to eliminate it. And then he goes into Planned Parenthood. And I think you get an idea of what he covers with that. And then Mated Not Begotten covers the controversy with using artificial means of conceiving a baby. So it goes from the whole topic of the problem with contracepting to avoid a pregnancy over to the flip side of those people who will use unnatural methods to get pregnant and why that's wrong, because that's also covered in Humana Vitae. And then he goes over the difference between natural family planning and artificial birth control, which I take a slightly more conservative view than him on that, because from my understanding reading Humana Vitae, natural family planning, and so far as the whole avoidance issue, should only be used in grave circumstances. And he argues that the word, really doesn't mean grave. But I disagree with that, because it says grave circumstances, like, one spouse is really sick and this is just not the time, which by all rights, generally if one spouse is that sick, you're not going to feel like doing the marital act. It's just not going to be appealing at that moment. Money issues, no, I don't ever go with the whole money issues thing, because God has a way of providing. And trusting in God to provide is essential. We're supposed to constantly rely on God and trust in his plan. We can't see his plan. His plan is way bigger than anything we can imagine. And sometimes there are surprises for us where God will be like, hey, this is what's going to happen. And you think, no, this can't be. This is not a good thing. And then down the road, sometime you see why that particular thing had to happen. It ends up being a good result. In scripture, when he talks about the scriptural basis against contraception, there's a part where he points out that after Joseph, if Rebecca had contracepted, there would never have been a Benjamin. And without a Benjamin, there would never have been a St. Paul. And as a result of that, a good chunk of the New Testament would have been gone. And so with the scriptural basis there, he provides evidence that not only would St. Paul not have been there in a good chunk of the New Testament, but the profound effect that contraception has on your family tree. So by contracepting, you're literally wiping out members of your family tree. So by a couple contracepting, they're literally affecting their family tree and what their lineage is supposed to be. So God may intend for a couple to have 5 kids, and instead they decide that they know better and they've discerned, and so they contracept and they avoid those kids. Same thing can actually be applied to natural family planning, that if a couple decides, we just don't want kids right now, and then they avoid their fertile times, which according to Humana Vitae is not okay. It's supposed to be serious circumstances, not I just don't feel like having a kid right now. And so that's sort of bucking God's plan. You never want to buck God. Bad idea. God knows what he's doing. You let him have his way. If you want to be happy and you want to make heaven, you let God have his way, because God knows what he's doing. So that was sort of my kind of moment in reading the chapter about natural family planning, because I think he plays a little bit too loose with that. Otherwise, the book is phenomenal. I mean, the chapter that he devotes to the scripture, he does a really thorough job, even going so far as to talking about Onan and the sin he commits, and the word that indicates that it wasn't so much just the fact that he withdrew and spilled his seed on the ground, therefore violating the law of what he was supposed to be doing by carrying on his brother's lineage through getting his brother's wife pregnant, but also he was using her for his own means. And that's highlighted on page 71 when he says, But the levirate breach only interpretation does not work. First of all, God is never presented in Scripture as a capricious deity who doles out capital punishment for minor infractions or human foibles. Second, as mentioned, the key verse, verse 10, refers specifically to what Onan did, to his act of withdrawal. And note that verse 9 indicates that his relations with Tamar were an ongoing affair and not a one-night stand. The Revised Standard Version cited above uses the word when he went into his brother's wife. But the sense of the original Hebrew is whenever, which is the way it appears in the New American Bible and others as well. Onan was repeatedly using his brother's widow for his own pleasure. So he's specifically using her for his own pleasure and inhibiting the act of reproduction, which is really, in the end, it's the purpose of marriage, for godly offspring. The whole purpose of marriage is to come together and become one. And a child is the product of that oneness, that joining together. They're literally the one flesh representation of that couple's union, which is why the marital embrace is intended for marriage, not for outside of marriage. And it's when activities happen that either inhibit that joining or the joining is done outside of the marital act that it throws things into chaos and sin. Because God designed things specifically for the man and the woman to come together and have that one flesh represented, that union of the two of them, which is also why children are a blessing to a marriage, not a curse. In fact, he also points out how in Scripture, every reference to having kids is a marriage being blessed. Barrenness was not a positive thing in the Scripture. It was more or less seen as a curse. Remember, for instance, Elizabeth. It was sort of kind of a shadow on her, if you will. It was not a blessing that she hadn't had a baby. And so when she's blessed with John the Baptist, it's kind of a big deal. And the same with Sarah and Abraham. In old age, she still hadn't had a baby. And so it wasn't something to be rejoiced over or applauded. It wasn't a whole, hey, let's have sex and we don't have to worry about a baby because that never happens. I think, no, they were not rejoicing over it. All those wonderful promises of God that were given to various men in the Bible, a lot of times included that they would have lots of offspring, that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that sort of thing. Having babies with your spouse is a good thing. He also does a really good job in the part about the Trinity, connecting Jesus' sacrifice on the cross with the marital act. In fact, there's a chapter where he elaborates on what St. Augustine said and says, taking a provocative step further, St. Augustine referred to the cross as the marriage bed of Christ. Like a bridegroom, Christ went forth from his chamber. He went out with the presage of his nuptials into the field of the world, wrote the Saint of Hippo. He came to the marriage bed of the cross, and there, in mounting it, he consummated his marriage. And where he perceived the size of the creature, he lovingly gave himself up in place of his bride, and he joined himself to the woman forever. Augustine's comparison is worth lingering on. On a symbolic level, does it not intimate something of the outlook we ought to have toward the life-bedecked consequences of each act of intercourse? More, if the cross stands for Christ's mystical bed and the consummation refers to his saving death, what kind of grotesque sacrilege would contraception signify? It would be Jesus ensuring in secret that his death on the cross was faked, that it did not really save us. In other words, the bridegroom defrauding his bride in a convincing and satanic lie. I mean, think about that really. Christ went up onto the cross, he was crucified, and he gave all of himself. Every last drop of blood was out of his body. He gave all of himself, held nothing back. So, in contracepting, instead of giving your all to your spouse, including your fertility, not denying your fertility, it's like Jesus in his consummation on the cross of giving himself completely to his bride and saving us. I mean, think about that really. I found that really, really profound, and just, it was a phenomenal thing. I even paused when I read it and read it to my husband because I thought, wow, really think about that. Jesus gave himself completely all on the cross, every last drop of blood. And if he hadn't, that would be kind of like, the equivalent of the contraception. When you contracept, you're not completely giving your all to your spouse in that case. You're only giving some of yourself. It may look like you're giving your all, but you're really not, because the end result of the sexual act is a baby, or at least the possibility of one. Every time a person has sexual intercourse, if they're not contracepting, the end result is a possibility of a new life. It's not a guarantee by any means, but it's a possibility. When a couple gets married, of the 3 things that they have to promise is fidelity, indissolubility, and openness to children. So there are times when a couple will pray outright that they want a child and to be blessed, but regardless, every time they are together in the marital act, they're required to be open to children. It's the same with older people who, maybe they found each other and it's very late in life and they're married for the first time, and say they're in like their 50s or 60s and the woman is past the point where she can have a baby. The requirement's to be open to children. Not to say, okay, we're going to do everything we can to get pregnant, but an openness. And hey, you never know, it does happen. So overall, I'd say it's a really great book. Definitely worth the read. I'm glad I read it. He doesn't go into Humana Vitae, the document itself, as much as I expected he would, but he does a really good job of explaining the why of Humana Vitae and the points of Humana Vitae. So it's definitely worth the read. If you're like me and you're already on board with Humana Vitae, then yeah, you're gonna like the book, especially once you get into like the 3rd chapter on. I mean, I remember when I read the 4th chapter, I went to my husband, I'm like, man, I think that's the best chapter yet. I'm loving this. But then I said the same thing about the 5th chapter and the 6th chapter, and it kept going, that each chapter just kept building upon itself. To the point where I was like, man, I'm glad I picked this up and read it. And it's funny that it just happened to be that I was almost done with the book. I was in chapter, I think 6 or 7, and there's 11 chapters, and then there's an epilogue. And yeah, I read that too. But I was reading it on the 25th, and I saw something come up on my Facebook saying it's the anniversary of Humana Vitae, and I thought, man, what a coincidence that this was the book that I was inspired to read on the anniversary of Humana Vitae. So I do highly recommend that if you have doubts or questions, or you're kind of like bucking the whole Humana Vitae thing, pick up this book. He will explain things to you, and he does a beautiful job, and he supports it with real evidence. So I mean, he has got the magisterium there, he's got the tradition there, he's got scripture there. He backs up the arguments, and he backs them up well. He also writes it in the tone of how he speaks. So a lot of the pages, as I'm reading it, it's like I could literally hear him talking. But then, I watch Coffin Nation too, so therefore I know what he sounds like. I remember what he sounded like when he was on Catholic Answers. But yeah, he takes a really good approach. So, I mean, even if you're one that sort of wants to argue against Humana Vitae, he'll put up a good fight for you here. It's definitely worth challenging yourself if you are opposed to it. But yeah, like I said, there's really 3 groups of people that he can cover with this book. Those who are against Humana Vitae and challenge it, that he can fight back on that argument and show why the teaching of the church is right. For those that are kind of wavering a little bit and they're not sure, but they think so, he's got you covered there too. And for people like me who are already on board with Humana Vitae, yeah, I mean, especially once you get into chapter 4, it rolls and it gets so good. In chapter 4, in a lot of respects, gave me a better understanding of the chapters 1 through 3. So I highly recommend this book. It's definitely worth the read. It's definitely worth the time. And it's good to read a book about a teaching of the church that someone was able to substantiate and give real evidence. It's not just opinion. He gives real substantial evidence. The Contraception Deception by Patrick Coffin. It's a very good read. I highly recommend it. I'm looking at 2 different books for my next book review, so you'll find out what they are when I actually do the review. And if you haven't yet, please click subscribe down below. If you like this video, please click the like button, and I hope to see you in my next video.